The world had shrunk to the size of their cave. Outside, the great ice bear, the spirit of winter, breathed its relentless, bone-chilling frost upon the land. For moons, the sun had been a pale, distant memory, a smear of weak light that did little to warm the snow-choked valleys and the iron-hard ground. For the people of the Red Deer, survival had become a grim ritual measured in the slow burning of their dwindling firewood and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. The cave, a deep limestone scar in the side of the mountain, was their fortress and their prison. The air within was thick with the smoke of the central fire, a haze that stung the eyes and coated the damp rock walls with a greasy film of soot. It smelled of unwashed bodies, cured hides, and the pervasive, underlying scent of fear. At night, the clan huddled together for warmth, a mass of fur-clad bodies listening to the mournful howl of the wind as it clawed at the narrow entrance. Cale felt the winter as a physical weight on his broad shoulders. As the lead hunter, the hunger of his people was his personal failure. He remembered the last successful hunt, weeks ago. Alone, aging reindeer, its bones sharp beneath its hide. It had provided a brief respite, but its meat was a fading memory, and the polished antlers now served only as a tool for chipping ice. His hunting party returned day after day with nothing but frostbitten fingers and the bitter taste of defeat. The great herds had moved on, far to the south, beyond the reach of men on foot. The smaller game rabbits, birds were buried in their burrows and nests, deep beneath the suffocating blanket of snow. He sat now, sharpening a spear point with a piece of sandstone, his movements economical and grim. Each scrape of stone on stone was a small act of defiance against the encroaching despair. Across the fire, his gaze fell on Alara. While others were hunched and withdrawn, their faces masks of weary resignation, she seemed to hold a different kind of light within her. Her work was to tend to the stores, a meager collection of dried berries, tough roots, and smoked fish that she rationed with painstaking care. But her eyes were often on the cave mouth, as if she could see through the swirling snow to a world that others had forgotten existed. She felt the change not as a sight or a sound, but as a subtle shift in the air, a different quality to the light that filtered into the cave for a few short hours each day. The winter's breath, which had been so sharp and dry, now carried a hint of moisture. The icicles that fringed the cave entrance, once hard as flint, now seemed to weep, a slow, almost imperceptible tear tracing a path down their length. Old Man Boar, the clan's elder and shaman, saw her watching. His face was a roadmap of 100 winters, his eyes clouded with cataracts but seeing more than most. He sat wrapped in the great hide of a cave bear his father had killed, his hands resting on the smooth, worn surface of the clan's storystone. He was the keeper of their memories, their rituals, their reasons. "The ice bear stirs in its sleep," he rasped, his voice dry as winter leaves. "Its dreams are troubled. Soon, it will wake and wander north, and the sun elk will return to our valley." Cale snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. "The spirits have been asleep for a long time, old one. My spear is hungry, and so are the children." "Patience, hunter," Boar said, his gaze unwavering. "You cannot spear the wind or trap the snow. You must wait for the world to turn. It always turns." The turning was agonizingly slow. Another week passed. The last of the smoked fish was gone. The children's cries were weaker, their games forgotten. The tension in the cave was a palpable thing, a coiled serpent ready to strike. It was during this darkest time that Cale announced one final, desperate hunt. "There is a small forest of pines on the western slope," he told the other 4 hunters. "The snow is not as deep there. Ibex may have come down from the high peaks to shelter. We will go. We will not return with empty hands." His words were a command, but also a prayer. They set out before dawn, 5 shadows against the blue-white landscape. Alara watched them go, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She offered a silent plea not to the great spirits of the hunt, but to the tiny, resilient life she felt stirring beneath the snow. While the hunters were gone, she felt an overwhelming urge to leave the stifling confines of the cave. Bundling herself in rabbit fur leggings and a heavy cloak, she ventured out. The cold was a shock, but the air felt clean and sharp in her lungs. She did not wander far, staying close to the relative safety of the cliff face. She ran her fingers over the bark of a birch tree, feeling the life dormant within it. She dug at the snow with a piece of antler, her fingers growing numb, searching for something she could not name. And then she found it. Beneath a thick crust of ice, pressed against the dark, frozen earth, was a single tiny green shoot. It was no bigger than her littlest finger, a fragile, almost impossible spear of life pushing its way toward a sun it could not yet see. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Carefully, she chipped away the ice around it, freeing it without damaging it. She did not pluck it. To do so felt like sacrilege. Instead, she knelt in the snow, simply looking, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with fire. This was the answer. This was the turning Boar had spoken of. She raced back to the cave, her heart pounding with a joy that felt foreign and exhilarating. She found Boar tending the fire, his face grim. The clan was silent, waiting. "The shoot!" Elara gasped, her breath pluming in the cold air. "By the birch tree. The first green. It has come." A murmur went through the gathered people. Heads lifted, eyes widened. Boar pushed himself to his feet, a difficult task for his old bones, and followed her out. He knelt where she had knelt, his old, clouded eyes examining the tiny plant. He touched it gently with a single gnarled finger. A long, slow smile spread across his wrinkled face, transforming his grim features. "It is the promise," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The long cold is over. The ice bear is leaving our valley." He looked up at the sky, at the pale, watery sun, and for the first time in months, it seemed to hold a genuine warmth. When Kale and the hunters returned that evening, they were exhausted, empty-handed, and their faces were carved with despair. They had found no tracks, no sign of life. "There is nothing," Kale said, his voice hollow as he dropped his spear by the fire. "The world is dead." "No," said Elara, her voice clear and strong in the sudden silence. "The world is waking up." Boar nodded, his eyes alight. "Tonight we endure. Tomorrow we prepare. The drums have been silent for too long. It is time to thank the spirits. It is time to dance the sun back to our lands." Kale looked from Alara's shining eyes to Boar's beatific smile, and for the first time, he felt the heavy weight on his shoulders begin to lift. He looked at the faces of his people, and saw not just hunger, but a flicker of a long-lost emotion, hope. Hope was a fire. It started as a single spark from Alara's discovery, and, fanned by Boar's declaration, it spread through the clan, chasing away the lingering shadows of winter's despair. The morning dawned not with a dramatic change in weather, but with a transformation in the people. The weary silence was replaced by a purposeful buzz of activity. The world outside was still cold, but the world inside the cave was coming alive. The preparations were a ritual in themselves. The women and older children took stiff brushes made of pine needles and swept the soot-blackened walls of the cave, a symbolic cleansing of the winter's gloom. Furs were taken outside to be beaten, releasing clouds of dust and the stale scent of confinement into the crisp air. Kale, his spirit renewed, led a party not to hunt, but to gather wood. They didn't just collect fallen branches. They sought out specific types of wood Boar had taught them to recognize: the dry, seasoned pine that would burn brightest, and the hard oak that would provide long-lasting coals for the feast. The most sacred task was preparing the drums. They were the clan's most prized possessions after their tools. There were 3 of them, each a hollowed section of a great log, the wood smoothed and darkened by generations of hands. The drumheads were made from the stretched, scraped hides of the great stags of autumns past. They had been carefully stored in the driest part of the cave, wrapped in bearskin. Now they were brought into the center of the main cavern with a reverence usually reserved for a successful kill. Boar supervised as the men gently warmed the hides by the fire, their fingers testing the tension, tapping the surface to hear the tone. The sound, at first just a dull thud, slowly sharpened as the hide tightened, finding its voice after the long, enforced silence. Elara and the other women had their own preparations. They brought out pouches containing their treasures, necklaces of polished river stones and the vertebrae of fish, armbands of woven grasses, and the small, precious feathers of the summer birds they had saved. They painted their faces and arms with red ochre, not in the fierce patterns of the hunt, but in swirling designs that mimicked the flow of the river and the unfurling of a fern frond. Elara drew a single, green, vertical line from her forehead down her nose, in honor of the shoot that had brought the promise of spring. As the sun began its descent, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, the energy in the cave reached a fever pitch. A great bonfire was built at the mouth of the cave, its flames leaping into the twilight, a beacon of defiance against the lingering cold. And then it began. Boar stood before the fire, holding a staff adorned with reindeer antlers and the feathers of an eagle. He raised it to the sky and let out a long, resonant chant, a call to the spirits of the clan, to the ancestors who had survived 100 winters before them. As his voice faded, a single drum began. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, the sound of a great heart stirring from a deep sleep. It was the sound of the earth itself, still half frozen but with life pulsing deep within. Then the second drum joined, a slightly faster, more complex pattern weaving around the first. Then the third, higher and more urgent. The cavern filled with the sound, a living, breathing entity that vibrated through the stone floor and into the bones of every person present. The first dancers were the elders, their movements slow and deliberate. They were bent and stooped, their dance a pantomime of the winter. They huddled together, shivering, their feet shuffling as they depicted the struggle to walk through deep snow, the pain of the cold, the weariness of the long dark. Then, with a sudden crash of all three drums, the younger hunters, led by Kale, leaped into the firelight. Their dance was one of power and frustration. They mimicked the hunt, stalking an invisible prey, their bodies coiled and tense. They launched imaginary spears, their muscles bunching. They showed the desperation of the failed hunt, their movements growing frantic, their heads shaking, their bodies slumping in defeat. Kale danced with a raw, fierce energy, pouring all the anxiety and burden of the winter into his movements. The music shifted again. The beat became softer, more sorrowful. Elara and the women glided into the space. Their dance was one of memory and longing. Their arms reached for the sky, for the absent sun. They swayed like trees in a cold wind, their fingers tracing the outlines of the summer flowers they remembered. It was a dance of hope held in the heart, a prayer for what was to come. Then Boar, with a sharp cry, struck the story stone with his staff. At this signal, the drumming exploded. The tempo became wild, joyful, and chaotic. All the dancers came together. The elders straightened their backs. The hunters cast aside their invisible spears. The women's longing turned to celebration. Everyone began to leap, to spin, to stamp their feet. It was the dance of the thaw. They were the river, breaking free of its ice. They were the seeds, bursting from the frozen ground. They were the bears, emerging from their dens. Kale found Elara in the swirling mass of bodies. He grabbed her hands, and she laughed, a sound as clear and welcome as birdsong. His grim mask was gone, replaced by a wide, joyous grin. He lifted her into the air, and her feet kicked towards the smoke-wreathed ceiling, her ochre-painted face radiant in the firelight. Their dance was no longer a performance of a story. It was the story itself, a torrent of pure, unbridled life. They danced until sweat poured down their bodies, until their muscles ached and their lungs burned. They danced out the fear and the hunger and the cold. They danced in the light of the returning sun, the promise of the feast, the warmth of the community. Finally, as the first hint of dawn touched the snow on the mountain peaks with a wash of pale pink, the drumming softened, slowed, and returned to the single, steady heartbeat. The dancing subsided, leaving the clan breathless, exhausted, and utterly renewed. They gathered at the mouth of the cave, their bodies steaming in the cold air. They stood together, looking out not at a dead, white world, but at a world full of possibility. The air was still cold, but it no longer held the threat of death. It held the clean, sharp promise of a new beginning. Kale stood beside Alara, their shoulders touching. They did not speak. There was no need. They watched the sun, now a brilliant gold, crest the opposite ridge, its light spilling into their valley, and they knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that they had survived. The heart of their world was thundering once more, and they were a part of its beat.